Ellen White Reconsidered, a series of presentations for people who have questions about Ellen White and her writings. Today's presentation is a response to Donald R. McAdams about the HUSS manuscript. Welcome, glad you could join us today. This video I hope to get out pretty quickly in response to a video I watched. There was a moment in the presentation of what are supposed to be historical facts that was very moving to me, as a lady by the name of Linda shared her great concern over recent issues and what was being presented in the video. I'll let her speak for herself.
For over 20 years, Ellen White has been a source of comfort and inspiration to me. I haven't read a lot of her books, but I did read like Steps to Christ. That was such a comfort. And Desire of Ages. And right now, you know, when I've listened to a lot of Ryan's, he got some taped on YouTube, and they make a lot of sense. They make a lot of sense. And I'm grieving because I've been a Seventh-day Adventist, let's see, for over 20 years, and Ellen G. White was a big part of that. I mean, not to prove anybody wrong or beat somebody over the head, but I mean to me personally. I know years ago when I was going through like a depressive period, her books, Mind, Body, Mind, and Character. I can't. It's 2 volumes set: Mind, Character, and Personality. Those books were such an inspiration to lifting my spirits. I'm grieving, and I don't know where to go. I don't know where to go.
She mentions Ryan Day, and we have responded to some of the issues there. And the Advent Defense League has also responded with actually a quite lengthy discussion about the investigative judgment. And the incredulity of Ryan Day does not mean that one should have to give up Ellen White's comments or our understanding of God's fairness in judging through an investigation and then an execution. That's always been his pattern. But to lay that aside, we're going to deal today with some of the statements that seem to undermine Ellen White, as it has to do with the HUSS manuscript. And this lady's pathos in her concern and where to go moved me. So I came right on here to be able to speak to you about this. So let me begin with a little bit of a background about what historians do. Historians, as my master's professor at Appalachian State told us, make truth statements about the past. They draw on original sources and historiography, that is the work of other historians, to interpret the past. So whenever humans are involved, the truth often gets skewed. Now, the term revisionist history is a term used to criticize historians who allegedly distort the past for political or presentist purposes. A presentist means that they look at the past through the present lens and see things differently or hold the past to a present standard. One example that I learned about in my studies there of world history, Civil War history, Latin American history, so on, was about how that historians during the Vietnam period reinterpreted the thinking of Civil War soldiers through the thinking of Vietnam soldiers. And that distorted their view of what they were fighting for. Thankfully, further study has gone through a treasure trove of letters written by those soldiers of the Civil War so that they can speak for themselves. And we recognize that there was a whole different thing going on. As it has to do with the revisionist historians that McAdams is describing, we could adapt the words of Ronald Reagan when he said, the trouble with our revisionist friends is not that they're ignorant, it's just that they know so much that isn't so. Now, it's true that we all revise our presentation of the past as we get new information. in my video, Ellen White Reconsidered number 17, I used a map that showed Ellen White's early travels in 1845 and the path that she took. It turns out that she didn't return from Poland down to Portland and then on to Orrington, but went straight on from Poland to Orrington. And so there's a minor inaccuracy there. And in future videos, I can fix that. And I was able to fix that before the map appeared in my new book, Glory, Glory, Glory. So we all get some things wrong. And that's why I presented some of the facts that I considered McAdams had misunderstood in a letter to him some years ago. And his response was cordial to me. He appreciated the fact that I was reinvestigating the material, but he really did not want to reinvestigate what he had researched. So here are some points that I want to clarify that he misunderstood at the time and carried that conclusion with him to the present. Before we get into McAdams' comments, I'd like to look first at the author's preface for the 1888 Great Controversy. This is the edition in which Ellen White added additional material when she was in Europe, particularly on this chapter regarding HUSS. So let's scroll down to a point down here where she's describing her use of sources. This is significant in the fact that this 1888 Great Controversy would be the first volume in the whole new series called The Conflict of the Ages. It would be the first one published, 1888. The second one would be The Patriarchs and Prophets, which is to redo the first volumes of the Spirit of Prophecy series. And so then she'd have the bookends. The last came first, the first came next, and then the next one in the series would be A Life of Christ, but it was given the significant title, The Desire of Ages. So last, first, middle, and then it wouldn't be till towards the end of her life, 1911 and 1917, that the other volumes in that series would be presented. So this description of her use of historians in working on history, which Bible history is history and ecclesiastical history is history, we look at her description of the use of sources. The great events which mark the progress of reform in past ages are matters of history, well known and universally acknowledged by the Protestant world. They are facts which none can gainsay. This history I have presented briefly in accordance with the scope of the book and the brevity which must necessarily be observed. The facts have been condensed into as little space as seems consistent with a proper understanding of their application. So she is telling us at the outset that what she is doing is condensing well-known history. Now, does that mean she didn't see glimpses of this history in vision? No. So let's go now to what McAdams was saying.
That Ellen White's work on John Huss had been directly copied from Wiley. Huss paraphrases, sometimes quotes, sometimes skipping chapters, sometimes skipping paragraphs, sometimes skipping multiple paragraphs.
Knowing what she wrote in the introduction, I was puzzled by his amazement that she had condensed from history. And when I started working on the manuscript itself, I have reviewed his transcription and improved it. We have worked together, Ron Grable and I, on that subject. I recognized that what she was doing a fact gathering. She wanted to pull out the particulars of history that were valuable to the narrative that she was trying to repeat. So there was much of that, of the details of history that weren't essential. Storytelling is as much what you leave out as what you put in. So she would leave out certain things. She would paraphrase things. She was telling the same history.
Now, the really interesting thing about this is that Ellen White then gave this rough draft to Marian Davis, her literary assistant. She was actually doing this work in Basel using the library of James Andrews, where she had become acquainted with Wiley. And Marian Davis was given the freedom, the liberty, to do whatever she thought necessary to make this ready for publication. Now, some of you have written books, and you know you go through many stages, and it's pretty complicated. This is actually pretty simple. Ellen White gave this to Marian Davis, and the instructions for Marian were to cut it down because the publisher, the Pacific Press, um, you know, did not want a long book. They wanted a smaller book than the one that had originally been planned. Sales issues. I mean, this is an interesting thing when you think about Ellen White's books. They were written with a market in mind, subject to a lot of the things that a lot of books are. So Marian Davis was given the freedom to work with this, and what she did, and this is really, I think, very astounding, she eliminated all of the spiritual digressions that Ellen White had thrown in, all the non-history she threw out.
He's not wrong about that. Those portions were some of the ones that mentioned the spiritual realities that were taking place.
She then cut out half of the historical narrative. And then she added about 15% more directly from Wiley, filling in gaps that she thought were needed to be filled for the reader's benefit.
Here's where later information would change that perspective. McAdams did not have access to what we call the Jerome manuscript. Part of this chapter was made up of the HUSS manuscript. Part of it was made up of the Jerome manuscript. And there were also portions that had already been in the book in Spirit of Prophecy Volume 4 that were carried forward. So there's a blending of the sources. This is what Marian was good at doing. She was able to take the different pieces that Ellen White gave her, select from them, and then put them together, arrange them, as Ellen White said that she did, arrange them in an order that helped the reader to follow what she was saying. Now, what he thought was added in by Marian Davis, when we do a more careful study, looking at the Jerome manuscript, and also the fact that 25 pages of this manuscript are missing, and the ending part of it is missing as well, we see that all of that might have been supplied, that he thinks might have been supplied, probably came from these missing pages and the Jerome manuscript.
So this is clearly not based on vision, because if it was based on vision, Marian Davis wouldn't have been comfortable cutting out half of it. And furthermore, she wouldn't have been willing to add a whole bunch more. So that when you read that today, was the 1888 Great Controversy. As you know, there was another edition in 1911, which didn't change much. Very, very few things. I can mention that in detail later if it's relevant. You might say Marian Davis was sort of the co-author of this chapter. It was Ellen White's vision and plan, vision with a small v. But Marian Davis had the freedom to basically rewrite it and select more stuff from the historian. And of course, in the process, errors were picked up. So
you can see how a historian can get most of the facts right, but have minor details that shade the picture a little bit differently, as we see here in where the material came from. It was Ellen White's selection. The only place I found where I could not correlate it properly was there was one quotation that was a slight expansion on what Ellen White had marked to include. It was just to finish out a couple of sentences to make it make sense. Now, the last matter that he brings up is about the errors, and that's what I spent the majority of my time in responding to him, dealing with. There's a document that goes through each of these supposed errors. In particular, he was concerned about the multiple times that Ellen White refers to HUSS leaving Prague and going back to his hometown. What he failed to recognize in that story was that HUSS himself said that he left Prague 3 times. And Ron Grable and I reconstructed the history to be able to look at when he was present, when he left, according to the clues that he gives in his description. And what he says is that he left at specific times, and one of those times was in 1411, at the time that the second interdict was put into effect. And he left briefly and then came back. So she's not wrong. HUSS confirms it. And if you're interested in the documentation on this, you can see it in the article, which I have linked in the description below. Another thing that he considered to be an error which he acknowledged that he could have been wrong on when I wrote to him, was there was a matter about paintings that were put up that represented the humility of Christ compared to the pomp and grandeur of the papacy. And he correlated it to some pictures that were in the chapel in Bethlehem, the Bethlehem Chapel. Whereas if you look more closely at the details, you discover that it said it was in the house that they lived, that they were in. These two painters that had painted it, it was in the place where they were staying. That would not be the chapel. So that is a detail that seems like an error, but it's not an error at all. And it was impressive to see that in visual representation. Another matter that he and I went back and forth on was about the description of the interdict. Now, this one's a little bit more complex, and I have dealt with it more in detail in the document, but he suggested that she was totally wrong. And when we look at the different historians who deal with this period, they all pretty much do the same thing that she did, and that is to describe the general effects of interdict, whereas he said that that interdict didn't have the same effect because the king opposed it. That's true. The king did oppose it. But what she says is that Prague was thrown into turmoil, and it was. Not because of the effects of the interdict, but because of the reaction to it and the conflict over it. And so she's not wrong, even though Wiley is her immediate historical source. And Wiley gets his account from a previous historian who carefully wrote out what took place. But unfortunately, that historian got two of the departures wrong, not by description, but by attaching it to the wrong year. And Wiley carries it over. So effects that might have come in a later interdict seem to be overlapping with the interdict that was stopped by the king. And so one was a little bit wrong, Wiley's a little bit wrong, but Ellen White does not repeat the same things. So she, in some inexplicable way, corrects that mistake. The only thing that she doesn't do is to point out overtly what took place. And she does describe the 1412 interdict and its effects as well. So, how was it that an untrained layman of history was able to get this all correct? It seems to me that God guided her in a way, even though she did do this work of fact gathering for this expansion of the chapter on Huss and Jerome in quite a hurry. It was correct. Well, there are other issues that we could bring up as well, but those are the major ones. And I would wish that those that hear that she copied errors would have this information and realize that instead of it being a mark of fallibility, that it was actually a mark of God's guidance. The chapter is correct.
To keep up with the latest in this series, be sure to subscribe to this channel.